At 61 years old, the only things left of Verna Sorensen's name were $1,043 in a checking account, and a deed to a rusted grain elevator the whole town had forgotten was still standing. For 34 years she had been Erland Sorensen's wife, and in all that time she had never once climbed to the top of that elevator. She thought she had known the man they had just lowered into the frozen ground. She was wrong. The wind on the North Dakota plain in late November does not blow. It scrapes. It works its way through every stitch of an old wool coat, finds the bone, and settles there like a guest no one invited and no one can make leave. Verna stood at the filled grave with the cracked, careful hands of a bookbinder folded in front of her, and she let the cold do its work. The crying she had finished 3 nights before. They say a funeral is for saying goodbye. But standing among the 4 dozen or so people hunched in black coats at the Cottonwood Reach Cemetery, it felt to Verna more like a roll being called. She recognized face after face and could not say why any of them had come. There was an old man at the back, leaning on a cane, trembling, his eyes red in a way that mere acquaintance never makes a man's eyes. There was a young woman holding a child on her hip, her lips pressed flat as if she were swallowing something down. Verna did not know them. She told herself Erland must have, back when he ran the elevator, back when this town still lived on wheat. What surprised her was how many came. Erland had been a private man. He did not go to church often, did not join the lodges, had no drinking friends, was never the center of any gathering. Verna had braced herself for a thin funeral, a handful of neighbors come out of duty. And yet that morning they arrived in a crowd, from towns an hour off, driving over roads still glazed with snow, standing silent in a cold that cut to the marrow. Many she had never met. Many wept in a way she did not understand, a way deeper than you weep for a man you only knew to nod at. Standing at the grave, Verna only thought it strange. She did not understand yet. It would take weeks and a ledger and a tin of letters before she understood that every soul in that cemetery was a line in a book, a family some quiet man had pulled back from the edge, and that they had not come to bury a neighbor. They had come to bury the one who saved their lives. A big man with a farmer's chapped hands came up to Verna after the service, meaning to say something. He opened his mouth, then thought better of it, and only gripped her hand in both of his rough ones, nodded, and turned away with wet eyes. Verna did not know who he was. She supposed he was some old business of Erland's. She did not know that 30 years back this man had nearly lost his whole farm, and that Erland had been the only one to reach out a hand. Some thank yous are too large to fit in the mouth. That morning at the graveside, Verna stood in the middle of an ocean of unspoken thank yous, and never knew it. Erland had died of a heart attack, quietly the way he had lived. One November morning he carried his coffee out to the porch to look at the cut wheat standing in stubble, and the cup slipped from his hand. 73 years old. He went so fast that Verna never got to tell him the last thing she had always meant to tell him. That she was grateful. That 34 years beside him had been a kind of luck a woman who'd once had nothing never dared to dream of. They had married when she was 27 and he was 39. She was his second wife. His first, Marguerite, had walked out when their daughter Sloane was 11, leaving Erland an angry child and a hollow house out at the edge of town. Verna never tried to take anyone's place. She only quietly mended what was torn, from the kitchen curtains to, in a way, the man himself. It was the thing she was best at in this world, mending what other people had given up on. Before Cottonwood Reach, Verna had lived another life she seldom spoke of. She had grown up in a children's home in Minnesota, and passed through one foster family after another, none of them keeping her long, because she was a child so quiet that grown people found her unsettling. She learned the bindery trade in a little print shop in St. Paul, where an old German craftsman taught her that a torn book is not a ruined book, only a book waiting for someone patient enough. She had lived her whole life by that. She believed it about books. She believed it about people. She had even on her better days believed it about herself. When she met Erland, she was repairing the old minute books for the County Farmers Association, and he was the silent man who brought in a leather-bound ledger with the spine pulling loose, asking if she could save it. She saved it. What she did not learn until much later was that the very first book he ever brought her to mend was the same book he would hide at the top of the elevator for the rest of his life. She had held his legacy in her hands on the first day and never known. Their marriage was a quiet one. Erland was not a man with sweet words. He showed love in small repairs. He fixed the leg of her book press when it cracked. He saved her the last cup of coffee every morning. In the evenings he sat reading the farm paper while she stitched a spine under the lamp, and the silence between them was not an empty space but a warm and full one, the silence of two trees that have grown side by side, so long their roots have laced together underground. Sometimes, in the later years, she had privately faulted him for being too closed, for driving out to that dead elevator to sit alone for hours and never telling her what he did out there. She did not know. God, she had not known. Sloane Pruitt, Erland's daughter, was 48 now, a lawyer who handled estates and real estate up in Fargo. She came to the funeral in a sharply tailored charcoal coat and shoes that took not one speck of the cemetery mud, though the ground was churned to slop. She gave Verna a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds, cold and flat as a contract. Then she leaned to Verna's ear, her voice so gentle that Verna nearly believed it, and said not to worry about the paperwork, she would handle all of it. Verna need only sign a few things to settle the after-death business. Verna nodded. Her head just then was as empty as a November field. She trusted that was the first mistake. 3 days after the funeral, Sloane summoned Verna to a branch office of a law firm in the next town over, a bright glass room marooned out on the prairie. On the table sat a thick stack of documents, the signature lines already flagged with little yellow arrow tabs. Sloane poured her a glass of water, sat down across from her, and began to speak in the even drone of someone reading scripture. This was the transfer of estate property, she said, the power of attorney so she could settle her father's tax debts, the inventory of assets. Words that reached Verna like the sound of running water. Verna had read all her life. She could restore 200-year-old books, could make out smeared faint on crumbling paper. But that day in that cold glass room, her eyes blurred and her hand shook and the words slid off her like a fish too slick to hold. She believed the woman across the table was Erland's own blood. She signed. She signed at every yellow arrow. One of them, on the 11th page, was titled Waiver of Marital Property Rights and Disclaimer of Statutory Inheritance. She did not read that line closely. That was the second mistake, and it was the one that nearly took everything. Later, lying on the cold plank floor of the elevator at night, Verna would run that morning back through her mind, and she would understand that Sloane's had planned all of it. She chose the right moment, 3 days after the burial, when the grief was still raw and Verna had not slept a whole night through. She chose the right voice, gentle, authoritative, salted with legal words, so that Verna felt foolish and grateful to have someone carry it for her. She chose the right way to lay the pages, slipping the poisoned one in among a stack of real funeral paperwork, so that as Verna leafed past it, it was only one more sheet in the whole sad pile that death makes. A good estate lawyer knows people are at their softest, not when they are angry, but when they are in mourning. And Sloane was a good estate lawyer. She just wasn't a good person. Verna signed for a reason she could never quite forgive herself for. She trusted. She trusted that the daughter of the man she loved would never hurt her. All her life, Verna had lived on the belief that there is something worth saving inside every person, the way there is in every torn book. And that was at once the most beautiful thing about her, and the seam Sloane had slipped through. A week later, a certified letter arrived at the wooden house. On the edge of town, the house Verna had lived in for 34 years. The letter informed her that, under the will of Erland Sorensen and the agreement Verna had voluntarily signed, the entire house, the land around it, and the joint savings of just over $200,000 would pass to the sole lawful heir, Sloane Pruitt. Verna had 30 days to vacate. Verna read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down in the wooden chair Erland had built with his own hands, laid the page on her knees, and looked out the window for a long while. Outside, the bare field ran to the horizon, and the North Dakota sky pressed down on it as heavy as a lid of lead. She did not cry. She only felt something inside her quietly close, like the door of a room you know you will never walk into again. She called Sloane. Sloane did not pick up. Verna left a message, her voice still level, asking whether there had been some mistake. 2 days later, Sloane called back, and this time there was no gentle scripture in her voice. She said it very clearly, very slowly, the way you say things to someone not very bright, that there had been no mistake. Verna had signed. Her signature was right there, black on white, witnessed and notarized. Her father had left a clear will, and Verna ought to be grateful her father had left her anything at all. Sloane read off the address of an old grain elevator on the abandoned rail spur at the west edge of town, along with an appraisal figure. $0. The elevator appraised at nothing, because it had been dead for 20 years and stood on land nobody wanted. Verna set down the phone. In her own account, after the funeral was paid for, there was exactly $1,043. She had 61 years, a bookbinding trade that almost no one in America needed anymore, an old Ford pickup, and an elevator worth nothing. That was everything 34 years had left her, or so she thought. In her last week in the house, Verna packed her life into cardboard boxes. She did not have much. A few sets of clothes, some pots, and the binding tools she prized above her own life. The leather paring knives, the bone folder gone amber with use, jars of hide glue and spools of linen thread, a wooden press she had worn to a shine with her own hands. And books. Hundreds of books she had rescued over the years. Ones other people had meant to throw out and she had carried home to mend. She wrapped them as carefully as you'd wrap a newborn. When she came to Erland's wardrobe, she stalled. She had not touched his things since the funeral. She drew a breath, opened the door, and the smell of him rolled out. Machine oil, wheat chaff, the cheap soap he'd used his whole life, though she'd bought him better. She stood there a long moment and let the smell hold her. This is the heaviest part of a person leaving, she thought. Not the funeral, not the condolences. It is mornings like this, standing in front of a closet still full of a man's warmth, knowing he will never wear any of it again, and still you have to lift each piece down, fold it, put it in a box. She had done this once before, years ago, when the old German who taught her the trade died, and she was the only one who came to clear his shop. She'd thought it would be easier this time, knowing how it went. She was wrong. It is never easier. Then her hand met the brown canvas work coat, the one he wore every day for decades running the elevator. She lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. In the right pocket was something hard. She reached in and drew out a brass weight, the kind that sits on the pan of an old balance scale, half a pound or so, cold and worn smooth by years of hands. Tied around it with a piece of twine was a square of cardstock, and on it, in Erland's hard block letters, the lettering she knew like she knew his face, were exactly 5 words. Top of the house. Behind the weights. Verna sat down hard on the edge of the bed. She turned the card over. The back was blank. She looked at the brass weight, at the 5 words, and something rose in her she could not name. Something that was half hope and half fear. Top of the house. What house? Erland had never called the elevator a house. He called it the elevator, the works, the job. But there was exactly one thing in his whole life that stood tall and straight as a house of many floors. The grain elevator. The next morning, Verna loaded the last boxes onto the bed of the Ford, set the brass weight on the passenger seat beside her, and drove away from 34 years without looking back. She would not let herself look back. She was afraid that if she did, she would not be able to leave at all. The road to the west edge of town was dirt, fields cut to stubble on either side, dark wet earth spread out under a gray sky. The Ford pitched and rolled over wheel ruts frozen hard, and then at the end of the road, it rose up in front of her. The grain elevator of Cottonwood Reach stood there, shooting up out of the flat country, like an abandoned cathedral of the plains. 6 stories or so, timber-framed and clad in tin, the tin rusted to a dried-blood brown, blotched here and there with patches of surviving silver. Across the top, in paint nearly weathered away, you could just make out the words Cottonwood Reach Farmers Co-op. A dead-end rail spur ran up to its foot and stopped, 2 rusted rails sinking into the weeds. The driveway door at the base hung crooked on its hinges. A high window had broken and been patched over with a board. Verna cut the engine. The silence of the plane rushed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the wind keening through the gaps in the tower, a low, long sound like the breathing of some enormous sleeping thing. She stepped out, her boots sinking into cold mud, and looked up at her inheritance. A bitter disappointment climbed her throat. This was what 34 years had left her. A heap of rotting wood and rusted tin in the middle of nowhere, appraised at 0. Verna stood at the foot of the tower, small as anything, and for the first time since the morning Erland died, she felt like sitting straight down in the dirt and giving up. She had heard people talk about towers like this one. When she first came to Cottonwood Reach, they called them prairie cathedrals, the grain elevators that stood along the rail lines all through the Midwest, rising over the dead flat country like the steeples of some religion that had died. Every wheat town had one. Farmers brought their grain. The elevator man weighed it and graded it. The grain poured into the great bins inside and then down into the rail cars that carried it across the whole country. The elevator was the heart of a town, The place, its money and its harvest and its fate all passed through. Then farming changed, the big steel terminals at the big towns swallowed it all, and the old wooden towers went dark one by one, left to rot under the rain and sun. The Cottonwood Reach elevator was one of those. A relic of a finished age, standing there only to remind people the place had once been alive. But she had nowhere else to go. She fished out the ring of keys Erland had left in the desk drawer, picked the biggest, most rusted one, and crossed to the driveway door. The lock was so stiff she had to throw her whole weight against it before it turned. The bolt let out a long shriek and gave. She pushed the door, the hinges screamed and the smell inside burst out at her. Old wheat chaff, sweet and musty, mixed with dust and rotting wood, the smell of 20 forgotten years. That smell touched something deep in Verna, because it was the same smell that had clung to Erland's coat every evening he came home. All those years she had smelled it on him, and never known where it came from. Now she was standing in its source. She was walking into the smell of her own husband, into the place he had vanished to every day, away from her, and she had never once asked why. Inside lay an enormous dark. Verna switched on her phone light. The beam swept across a soaring room, timber posts thick as a man's body holding up the dark above. In the middle stood the old grain scale, a great wooden platform with a balance beam gone to rust, and beside it a little wooden rack still neatly holding a few brass weights just like the one from Erland's pocket. Dust lay over everything like gray snow. The belts that had once carried grain up the tower were now only the rotting skeletons of belts. Verna walked slowly inward, her footsteps echoing up into the empty height. Top of the house, behind the weights. She tilted her head back and looked up. Above the storage floor, a narrow wooden stair zigzagged up the inside wall of the tower, up and up, lost into the dark. Her heart beat faster. To reach the top, she would have to climb that whole groaning stair. But she did not climb it that day, because just as she set her foot on the first step, a sound froze her where she stood. A noise behind her, from a dark corner of the storage floor. A rustle, then breathing. Someone was in here with her. Verna spun, the flashlight beam shaking across the corners. Her heart slammed. Her first thought was that Sloane had sent someone. She gripped the brass weight in her hand like a weapon. Then the light caught a shape in the shadow behind the scale, and she saw. A young man pressed into the wood of the wall, both hands up against the light, his mouth working to say something and getting out only broken, stumbling sounds. He was 18, 19 maybe, thin inside a coat too big for him, his hair a tangle, his eyes wide and frightened as a cornered animal's. Beside him, leaned against the wall, was a broom, and the floor around where he sat was swept spotless, not a speck of dust, a clean circle in the middle of a whole room gone gray. Verna lowered the light. She understood he meant her no harm. He was the one afraid of her. She softened her voice and asked who he was, what he was doing here. The young man struggled to speak, his lips moving, trying to push out a word that kept catching in his throat, repeating the first sound over and over. It took a long while, and all the patience a lifetime of fine, slow work had built in her, before Verna could piece the story together. His name was Emmett. He stuttered, badly enough that the whole town had long since taken to calling him the slow one, the dummy. Though he was neither dumb nor slow. He was 19. His mother had left when he was small, his father had drunk himself to death, and Emmett scraped by on the odd jobs nobody wanted to hand a boy who couldn't get a sentence out. And for the past few years, every morning, he had come to this elevator to sweep. Because Mr. Erland paid him. Every week the old man gave him a little money, and more than that, he talked to him. He waited for Emmett to finish his sentences, never cut him off, never said the word for him. He called him by his name, Emmett. Verna stood very still. For all those years she had thought Erland drove out to this abandoned tower only to sit alone to hide, the way men hide. She had never known that he paid a boy the whole town had cast off so that the boy would have work to do and someone to talk to. She had never known. The boy went on, one piece at a time, and it took a long while. He told her Mr. Erland taught him how to sweep right, taught him to keep the tools in order, taught him to read, because Emmett had hardly been able to read at all when he first came. Mr. Erland brought books, easy ones, and every morning after the sweeping the two of them sat by the window and he showed Emmett the words one at a time, patient, never once acting hurried when Emmett stumbled. He said a thing to him that Emmett now repeated to Verna, working hard to get the whole of it out. Mr. Erland said a man who reads slow or fast is a man all the same, and a man who's slow to speak is usually quick to think, only nobody'll wait long enough to hear it. Verna had to turn her face away so the boy wouldn't see her eyes. Because she understood that the man who had taught a thrown-away child to read by the window of a grain elevator was the same man who had sat across from her in silence every evening for 34 years, reading his paper, telling her nothing. He had done all of this 15 minutes drive from her own kitchen, and she had not known. Top of the house, behind the weights. Verna looked at the young man, then up at the stair, vanishing into the dark. And for the first time she felt that the husband she'd thought she understood for 34 years was a man she had only ever known the half of. Emmett, once his fear had eased, led her around. With his halting words and his pointing hand he showed her where he kept the broom, where Mr. Erland used to sit, the rickety wooden chair by the window that looked out on the rails. And when Verna asked whether he knew what was at the top of the tower, Emmett shook his head. He had never been up there. Mr. Erland wouldn't allow it. He said the top was his place, and that one day it would be somebody else's. Dark came down fast, the way it always does in a northern winter. Verna decided to spend that first night in the storage room, spreading a thin pad on the plank floor near the scale, lighting an old oil lamp she found on a shelf. Emmett would not go home. He said, and it cost him a long struggle, that he would sleep in his corner, keep watch. Verna meant to tell him to go on home, and then she realized he had no home to go to. She nodded. That night, two people the whole world had pushed to the margins slept under the roof of a tower worth nothing, and outside the prairie wind sang a long song with no words. Before she lay down, Verna sat by the oil lamp a while, and did the thing she always did when her heart was unquiet. She took out a book she was partway through mending, a needle, a length of linen thread, and began to sew the spine back together in the yellow light. Her hands moved steady, sure, a rhythm worn into her over 4 decades. The needle through, the thread drawn, pulled tight. Through, drawn, tight. There is a comfort in mending. A book come apart at every page that looks ruined, thrown away. Under patient enough, it comes one whole thing again, stands again on a shelf, gets read another 100 years. Verna had lived her whole life on that, and tonight, in a strange tower, she held on to it like a rope in the dark. She thought, maybe I'm a book come apart at the seams myself just now. A life she'd thought was bound up tight, suddenly torn open, the pages scattered. But if there was one thing she believed, it was that no book is too far gone to mend, so long as a hand is willing. She did not know whose hand it would be. She did not yet know that the man who was gone had already prepared that hand for her, years ago from the top of this very tower. Verna lay awake a long time. She thought about the words on the card, about the stair that climbed into the dark, about the boy asleep in the corner, the child her husband had quietly taken in and never once mentioned to her. She thought, maybe Erland was never the closed-off, gone-dry man she'd sometimes privately blamed. Maybe he was only a man who kept things. And maybe everything he'd kept was waiting for her up there, behind the weights at the top of the house. A few days after she found the brass weight, before she ever climbed, Verna drove into town to the office of Dale Aldous, just as the letter in Erland's envelope told her to. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, you should climb. And the morning after that first night, when the first thin gray light came through the gaps in the tower, Verna climbed. The wooden stair cracked under every step. Verna kept one hand on the wobbling rail, the flashlight in the other, and went up one tread at a time, slow and sure, the way she turned the pages of a rotting book. The higher she went, the thicker the air grew with dust and the dry, warm smell of cedar, strange and warm in the cold. Through the gaps in the wall the wind whistled, and thin blades of light cut across the dust-hung dark. She climbed past the second floor, the third, past the great grain bins now standing empty, her footsteps booming back at her like a drum in a hollow temple. More than once she had to stop and catch her breath, a hand pressed to her chest, her heart going not just from the effort but from something else. She was 61. Her knees were not what they had been, and this stair was steep and narrow and trembled under her weight. But every time she thought of turning back, she thought again of the 5 words on the card, of the care with which Erland had tied it to the weight and left it in his coat, as if he had known that one day she would have to find it, would have to climb up here. He had never done anything without reason. If he had left her this road, then, at the end of it, there had to be something worth the climbing. And so she went on, one step at a time, up into the dark. She thought of all the times Erland had climbed this stair. Every morning, for years, the man had climbed up here alone, carrying his book, and sat in the room at the top, and written down the good he had done that no one was allowed to know. She pictured him, his back already stooped, his knees aching as hers ached now, still climbing, still going up, still keeping. How many mornings had he told her he was running out to the elevator a while, and driven off, and she had only nodded, never asking what he did up there. Now she was walking the very steps he had walked 1,000 times. And she felt nearer to him, in that dark stairwell, than in all the years they had sat side by side under the lamp at home. At the very top, the stair opened into a small room, the cupola, where in the old days a man worked the chutes that spilled the grain. A round window looked out over the whole plain to the horizon, and the morning light came into this room more than anywhere else in the tower. Along one wall stood a wooden rack, and on it a row of brass weights in every size, from a tiny 1-to-1 as big as a fist, set in order, polished clean, not a speck of dust on them. In a whole rotting tower, this one rack of weights had been kept like treasure. Behind the weights, Verna's hands shook. She set the flashlight down and began to lift the weights from the rack, one by one. They were heavy and cold in her palm. When the rack was bare, she ran her fingers along the board behind it, pressing, tapping, searching, and then in the lower right corner, her finger caught a seam. She pushed hard. The board slid aside with a soft click, and there in the wall was a hidden wooden compartment, maybe a hand's depth deep. Verna held her breath. Before I tell you what Verna found in that compartment, I want to stop for 1 second. If stories like this one mean anything to you, if you believe that the quiet goodness of a person never truly dies, please take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. There are things a person does in the dark that no one ever knows, for a whole lifetime, until someone is willing to climb all the way to the top to find them. Now let's go back to Verna and to the compartment at the top of the tower. Inside the compartment, wrapped in a square of muslin gone yellow, lay a book. A large ledger, its black leather cover worn soft at the corners, so thick she had to use both hands to lift it out. Beside it sat an old tin biscuit box, a Christmas tin with a faded Santa on the lid, and underneath a heavy paper envelope, sealed with one word on the outside in Erland's block letters. Verna. She sat down on the floor of the cupola, in the round window's flood of light, the very place where months later she would sit and weep, and she opened the ledger. On the first page, at the top, Erland had written a single line. This book is for what was kept back. Below it ran careful hand-ruled columns, a date, a name, a number of bushels, and a last column for a note. Verna read the first line, dated early in the 80s, 3 years before she and Erland married. The name was Halvor Berg. The grain, 200 bushels. The note read, bank foreclosing, wife sick, took no money, logged as storage. Verna frowned. She turned to the next line. Another name, another family, a winter 2 years on. Note, barn fire, lost all his seed for the next planting, lent 300 bushels seed, struck out in the fall. The next line. The next. She read slowly, line by line in the rising light. A summer in the mid-80s, the Lindquist family, youngest, needed heart surgery in Minneapolis, couldn't pay, added 200 bushels to the book, made up out of mine. An autumn later, old person, wife just passed, drinking, couldn't pay back his seed, struck it out, and one more short line, sat with him 3 evenings, he's better. A winter at the decade's end, a woman's name, Astrid Moe. The note only this, husband hits her, needs money to leave, gave enough for a bus and 3 months' rent, kept off the co-op books. Year after year, one name leading to the next. A chronicle of kindness, kept in the dark of a grain elevator for the better part of 40 years. And Verna began to understand. When the Cottonwood Reach elevator was still working, it was where the farmers of the whole region brought their grain to store, to weigh, to sell. Erland was the man who ran it, who held the scale, who kept the book. He was the one who decided what each farmer's bushel weighed, what it was worth. It was a small power, but in a town that lived on wheat, it was an absolute one. And for decades, from the farm crisis of the 80s when one farm after another went under to the banks, Erland had quietly used that small power in a way no one ever saw. When a family lost its crop, he let them store seed grain at no charge, logging it as ordinary storage so no one would notice. When a farmer fell short of what he owed the bank, Erland tipped the scale up a little, just enough to carry the man through a season, and made up the difference out of his own grain. When a widow had nothing left, he lent her seed, and then, come fall, quietly struck the debt from the book. Page after page, year after year, hundreds of lines, hundreds of names, hundreds of times one quiet man had stood between a family and its ruin, and quietly taken the weight. Verna did the arithmetic in her head, and the figure left her dizzy. Add up all the bushels he had given, struck out, made up from his own share over the years, and it came to a sum that would have let the two of them live comfortably to the end of their days. Erland was not poor because he didn't know how to get on. He was poor because he had chosen to be. Every bushel he gave away was a bushel that should have gone in his own pocket. The thrift of him, the cheap soap, the coat mended and mended again, the worn-out pickup, all the things Verna had privately grieved for him were not because they had no money. They were because their money had quietly run out into the names in this book, and at the bottom of every page, Erland had written the same line, like a charm, like a vow. Always keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. Keep a little back. Verna sat there a long time, the ledger open on her knees, the morning light shifting from gray to gold to white, and she wept. Not this time for losing Erland. She wept because she was meeting him again, the true him, the man she had slept beside for 34 years and never truly known. The man she had sometimes privately blamed for being dry, for burying himself in his elevator, had been coming out here every day not to weigh grain but to weigh kindness. To keep a little back. For the one who comes with nothing. The way she herself had come now. A woman who had arrived with nothing. When she opened the tin box, dozens of letters spilled out. Thank you letters, handwritten, some neat and some scrawled, some on good paper and some on the back of a receipt. One from the widow of Halvor Berg, thanking Mr. Erland for saving their farm, writing that thanks to him her son finished high school instead of dropping out to work. One from a man who was a grandfather now, telling how if Mr. Erland had not lent him seed that year, his family would have had to leave Cottonwood Reach and he'd never have had the life he'd had. Every letter carried the same question. Why did you never tell anyone? Why did you keep it secret? And Verna, the letters trembling in her hands, understood the answer. Because kindness that needs to be known is no longer holy kindness. Erland kept it secret, not out of shame. He kept it because to him it was simply the thing you did. Quiet as keeping an oil lamp burning through the night. Last, Verna opened the envelope with her name on it. Inside was a long letter in Erland's hand and a sheaf of legal papers stamped and notarized. She read the letter first. My Verna, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you found the way to the top of the tower. I'm sorry I never told you about the book while I was alive. It wasn't that I hid it from you. It's that some things a person does, he does in silence, and I was afraid that if I spoke it out loud, it would turn into something else, into a credit, a thing to be admired. I didn't want that. You are the only one I wanted to leave this book to, because you are the only one I knew would understand. The letter went on. I know Sloane. I have known the girl since she was small, and I know what grew in her after her mother left. I tried. I loved her as hard as a father can, but there are things in a person that love does not reach. I'm afraid that when I am gone, she will try to take everything from you. So I prepared. Don't be afraid. Everything you need to keep this tower, and to keep anyone from putting you out of it, is in these papers. Take them to Dale Aldous in town. He knows what to do, and at the end Erland had written, this tower isn't worth a penny on any appraisal, but it is the most precious thing I own, because inside it are all the years I tried to keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. Now it is yours. Keep the lamp burning. Always keep a little back. I love you, Erland. Verna folded the letter, pressed it to her chest, and sat a long while beneath the round window, looking out over the North Dakota plain that ran to the horizon in the winter light. Below her she could hear the steady sweep of Emmett's broom across the plank floor. A patient, dependable sound, the same every day. Erland's kindness was still here, still living, in every stroke of a broom held by a boy the whole town had thrown away. She did not yet know what was in the sheaf of papers. But for the first time since the funeral, Verna Sorensen felt something come back into her that she'd thought was lost. She felt that she was not empty-handed anymore. A few days later, papers in hand, Verna drove the Ford into town, to the office of Dale Aldous, exactly as the letter said. The office was up on the second floor of an old brick building on Main Street, a small room crowded with dusty law books and the smell of strong coffee. Dale Aldous was past 70, the only lawyer still practicing in Cottonwood Reach, a stooped old man with thick glasses who spoke slow. When Verna laid the papers on his desk and said Erland's name, his face softened. Well, so it's time. It turned out Dale had known. 9 years back, it was Dale who had helped Erland set up a trust and sign a covenant. He told Verna, slowly, about the afternoon Erland came into this office, set the elevator's deed on the desk, and said he wanted to do a thing. Erland said he knew his daughter. He loved her, but he knew her. And he knew that when he died, a day would come when his gentle wife would be put out on the road, and he had to prepare something no one could take from her. He had asked one question over and over, Dale said. How do I make it so that no matter what they trick Verna into signing, the tower is still hers? And Dale had shown him the way. The way was a living trust. Years before he died, Erland had moved the elevator and its 12 acres and the rail spur rights into a living trust, with Verna as the sole beneficiary. Dale explained it to her in plain words, and as he explained, Verna understood the whole shape of what her husband had done. Property held in a living trust is not part of a person's estate. It does not pass through the will. It is not part of the estate to be divided, and it could not be touched by the waiver of inheritance. Sloane had tricked Verna into signing, because that waiver only reached the estate, and the tower had left the estate 9 years before, back when Verna herself didn't even know it existed. Then Verna asked the question that had been gnawing at her. If he could protect the tower, why not the house? Why not the savings? Why leave those where Sloane could reach them? Dale took off his glasses and wiped them, and he answered slowly. He said her husband had left her everything in his will, the house, the savings, all of it. But a will can be contested, and a will can be undone by a waiver, the way Sloane undid it. A trust cannot. Erland could not have known Sloane would go so far as to take even the house, but he made dead certain that the one thing that carried the work, the one irreplaceable thing, was locked away beyond any challenge she could ever bring. He chose the tower, Dale said, because the tower was where the work lived. He could rebuild a house. He could not rebuild 40 years of names. Then Dale turned to the second paper, and his slow face nearly smiled. Years before, Erland had also signed a permanent conservation and community land covenant with a North Dakota Agricultural Heritage Trust. Under it, the Cottonwood Reach Elevator was recognized as a historic agricultural structure, and the land it stood on could never be used for industrial or commercial development, never be demolished, never built over with a steel terminal or a transload station. The covenant ran with the land. It bound every owner, present and future, forever. In other words, even if by some miracle anyone ever wrested the land away from Verna, they could never do the one thing that would make it worth their while. They could never tear down the tower, never build their station. Whatever scheme anyone might bring, it was dead before it started, dead on the page. Verna sat a long while in that dusty room of law books. Dale said one more thing she would carry with her always. He said, "Your husband was the most careful man I ever met. Not because he was afraid, but because he loved. People only prepare that thoroughly for the things they love to the bone. He didn't build this trust to protect a tower. He built it to protect you." Verna left Dale Aldis's office with something she had not had since the funeral. Not relief, steadiness. The feeling of a person who has just discovered that the ground beneath her was quietly poured in concrete, long ago, deep down, just to hold her up on the very day she thought she would fall. Word that someone had moved into the old elevator, went through Cottonwood Reach, the way all word goes through a small town. And one afternoon, a few days on, there was a knock at the driveway door. Verna opened it to an old man. The same trembling old man who had stood at the back of the funeral, the one with eyes read the way only a man who owes a deep debt has them. He gave his name as Halvor Berg. Verna knew the name. It was the first line in the ledger. Early 80s, 200 bushels, bank foreclosing, whoops, took no money. Halvor was 84. He had come, he said, because he'd heard Erland's wife was out at the tower, and he wanted to tell her something. Verna brought him in, made him a pot of tea on the oil stove, and sat to listen. Halvor told it, his voice shaking, about the winter the bank threatened to take his farm, when his wife lay bedridden with consumption, and he had not a dollar. He'd been ready to quit, he said, ready to pack the family up and leave Cottonwood Reach. He told about the morning he brought his last bushels to the elevator, meaning to sell every last one for a little medicine money, and how Erland, the man on the scale, had looked at him, then quietly logged it as storage and pressed into his hand the money for 300 bushels, though he'd only brought in 2. Halvor said he had never understood it. Only later did he work out that Erland had made up the difference as of his own grain. And on that money his wife pulled through, his farm was saved. His son finished high school and was a doctor now down in Bismarck. Halvor set down his teacup, his old hands shaking, and said that in his whole life he had never thanked Erland enough, because Erland would never let him, waving it off every time he tried, saying it was only a little slip on the scale. Verna took out the ledger, opened it to the first line, and turned it toward the old man. Halvor looked at his own name, at Erland's hand, and broke down, an 84-year-old man weeping like a child. "So he wrote it down," Halvor said through his tears. "All these years I thought it was only me. I never knew there was anyone else." "There were so many," Verna said softly. She turned the thick pages. There were so very many others, and after Halvor they came one by one. The word spread that Erland's wife kept a book with the name of everyone he'd ever helped, and one person, then two, then a dozen, found their way to the tower. A middle-aged woman, the daughter of a family Erland had once saved, brought a fresh-baked loaf of bread. A man who'd lost an arm to a piece of farm machinery told how Erland had quietly paid his hospital bill through a charge logged as shed rent. An old pastor told how the church's charity fund had received anonymous sacks of grain every fall for 20 years. And only now did he learn where they came from. There was a woman named Astrid Moe, in her 70s now, her hair gone white, who came one afternoon and sat a long time before she could bring herself to tell it. She was the name Verna had read in the book, the note that said husband hits her, needs money to leave. Astrid told it, her voice small and shaking, how that winter she had come to the end of everything, no money, no one to turn to, and how she had begun to think the things a desperate woman thinks. She'd gone to the elevator to sell her last few sacks of grain. Erland had looked at her, asked nothing, only gone inside and come back with enough for a bus ticket and 3 months' rent in another town, pressed into her hand with a slip of paper, an address of a safe place. Astrid said she had lived because of that one afternoon, had made a new life, a decent life, all because of it. And she had never been able to thank him, because Erland told her not to come back, not to speak of it, just go and live well, and that would be thanks enough. A younger man, Travis, came with his wife and 2 small children. He wasn't in the book, but his father was. He told how his father, before he died, had told him about the elevator man who had saved the family's farm from foreclosure when Travis was a boy. His father had charged him, "If you're ever in a place where you can help somebody, remember Mr. Sorensen and do what he did." Travis said he had a small farm of his own now, and every fall he quietly left a few sacks of grain at the church, telling no one. He had not known until today that he was doing the very thing the man who saved his father had done. Kindness, it turned out, runs in a line that blood never manages. Cottonwood Reach, the town that had seemed to die along with its wheat fields, came alive again around the rusted tower. Every day someone new arrived. They brought their stories, their food, their late and overdue tears. And they brought the thing Verna needed most of all. They brought her the truth about the man she had loved. Each story was a piece, and slowly, out of the pieces, the whole portrait of Erland Sorensen took shape. A man who had wanted only one thing in this life, to do one thing in silence. Keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. Verna saw something then that warmed her and hurt her at once. All through their years together, whenever she'd asked Erland how they could have so little put away when he worked so hard, he had only smiled and said, "We've got enough to eat and a roof, that's plenty." She had taken it for the resignation of a man with no ambition. Now she understood it was the choice of a man with something larger than ambition. He had chosen, over and over his whole life, to set the survival of strangers above his own comfort, and he had done it without ever once letting his wife know, because he didn't want her to carry the weight of the sacrifice. He carried it alone. That was at once the most noble thing in him, and the thing that made Verna wish he had trusted her enough to share it. Emmett listened to those stories with shining eyes. He had never known that the man who'd been good to him had been good to so many. One evening, with great effort, he managed to tell Verna that he wanted to stay here, to go on sweeping the tower. Verna took his thin hand in hers and told him this was his home, for as long as he wanted it. And that night, for the first time, Emmett slept without fear. But in a small town, no news stays secret for long. And word of the ledger, of the crowd coming out to the tower, traveled all the way to Fargo, to Sloane Pruett. One cutting cold December morning, a glossy black SUV, absurdly clean against the muddy dirt road, pulled up in front of the tower. Verna was inside mending the cover of a book when she heard the car doors. She set the book down, wiped her hands, and went out. Sloane Pruett stepped out in an expensive camel coat and high leather boots. With her came a man of about 50, hair slicked back, wearing a shearling ranch coat of the kind that only exists in magazines, a smile fixed on his face like a billboard. He introduced himself as Brock Lenhart, a broker in agricultural and energy real estate, and put out his hand to shake Verna's with the too-hard grip of a man who's used to forcing his way. Sloane did not waste time. She looked around the storage room, at the oil stove, at Verna's sleeping pad, at Emmett's corner, with a flicker of disgust she didn't bother to hide. Then she said, smooth as a reed contract, that she'd come to discuss a thing that was good for everyone. She said she understood how hard it must have been for Verna to leave the old house, and she was not a heartless person. So she and Mr. Lenhart had an offer. Brock Lenhart stepped up, opened a glossy folder, and spread out a rendering. He spoke about the potential of the land. 12 acres, an old rail spur with usage rights still attached, an ideal spot for a modern grain transload station tied into the main line. A large company was interested. They'd take the old tower down, he said, patting the wood wall with a kind of pity, and put up a modern steel terminal and turn this place into a real going concern. Then he said the number. $46,000, cash, for the land and the tower both. He said the number slowly to let it sink in, watching Verna with the eyes of a man certain he'd just changed a life. To a woman of 61 with a little over $1,000 in the bank, $46,000 was a fortune. A new roof, safety, no more sleeping on a plank floor through a North Dakota winter. And here is the thing Verna would later admit to herself. For a moment she considered it. She was human, and she was tired, and she was cold, and she was 61 years old. $46,000 meant she could buy a small warm house in town, with central heat, with hot water, with a real bed instead of a pad on the floor. It meant she would not have to fear the coming winter. It meant she could rest for the first time in her life, after a whole life spent bent over mending what was torn. The ache in her bones whispered, "Take it, you've borne enough." For a moment the door swung open in front of her, and it was warm, and it was easy. Then she looked into the tower, where Emmett stood pressed behind the scale, his eyes following her, anxious. She thought of 84-year-old Halvor Berg weeping. She thought of Astrid Moe, of Travis and his 2 children, of the hundreds of names in the book. She thought, if I take this $46,000, they will tear down the tower, raise a steel terminal, and one day no one will remember there was ever a man here who held a scale and quietly saved a whole town. The book will become a curiosity in a box. And Emmett, the boy with no home to go to, will have no home again. The charm will die. Keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. If I sell, there will be nothing left to keep back. Verna thought all of that in the space of a single breath. Then she shut that warm, easy door, gently, finally, the way she had shut so many other doors in her life. Sloane smiled. It was a very generous offer, she said, far more than this heap of rotting wood was worth. She advised Verna to take it, and to take it fast before the company changed its mind. Verna stood quiet a moment. She looked at the rendering, at the number, at the smiles on Sloane and Brock. She said in a level voice that she thanked them for the offer, but the tower was not for sale. Sloane's smile set hard. She stepped closer and her voice changed, dropping the sugarcoating entirely. She said Verna did not understand her position, that on paper the tower belonged to Verna only because her father had left it like a scrap of charity. But Verna ought to remember, Sloane said, that the tower stood on land that had been marital property, and that Verna herself had signed away all rights to it. If Verna made trouble, Sloane could perfectly well take it to court, argue that leaving this property to her was an error in the will, or worse, that Verna had manipulated a frail old man at the end of his life. And Sloane was an estate lawyer. A suit like that against a penniless widow with no one in her corner would drag on for years and bleed Verna dry. Be smart, Sloane said. Take the $46,000 and go, before you lose even that. The air in the storage room thickened. Brock Lenhart kept his smile, but his eyes had gone sharp as a hunter's. Emmett trembled behind the scale, and Verna, a woman of 61 who had spent her whole life with her head down, mending what was torn, stood there between 2 powerful people pressing her to surrender. Before I tell you what happened next, the thing Erland himself had quietly prepared years in advance, for exactly this moment, I want to say one thing to you. If this story has reached you by now, if you also believe that the kindest and quietest among us deserve to be protected, please tap subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Because what comes next is proof of something Erland Sorensen believed his whole life, that kindness, if it is patient enough and wise enough, can build itself a shield that no greed can break. Now, let's go back to Verna. Verna did not answer right away. She turned and went inside, opened the small cedar chest she had carried down from the top of the tower, and took out the sheaf of papers from the envelope with her name on it. She had already taken them to Dale Aldous, just as Erland's letter said. She had sat in his dusty room of law books, heard him tell of the afternoon 9 years gone, understood what every line in this sheaf meant. She had not come out here to beg. She had come with bedrock under her feet. Now she carried the papers back out and set them down on the lid of a cardboard box in front of Sloane. "Perhaps," Verna said, her voice still soft, "you ought to read a few things too." Sloane picked up the sheaf with a sneer. But as her eyes ran down the first line, her face began to change. The first document was an instrument establishing a living trust, dated 9 years before, witnessed and notarized in full. Under it, Erland Sorensen had transferred ownership of the grain elevator and all 12 acres, along with the rail spur rights, into that trust 9 years ago. The sole beneficiary of the trust was Verna Sorensen. Sloane went pale. As an estate lawyer, she understood at once what that meant. Property held in a living trust is no longer the personal property of the deceased. It does not pass through the will. It is not part of the estate to be divided, and most of all, it was never touched by the waiver of inheritance she had tricked Verna into signing, because that waiver reached only the estate. The tower had left the estate 9 years ago, when Verna had not even known it existed. Brock Lenhart, not following the legal terms but reading Sloane's face, asked what was wrong. Sloane did not answer. She turned to the second page, and her face went paler still. The second page was a permanent conservation and community land covenant Erland had signed years before with the North Dakota Agricultural Heritage Trust. Under it, the Cottonwood Reach Elevator was recognized as a historic agricultural structure, and the land it stood on could never again be used for industrial or commercial development, never be demolished, never built over with a terminal or a transload station. The covenant ran with the land. It bound every owner, present and future, for all time. In other words, even if by some miracle Sloane and Brock had taken the land, they could never have done the one thing that made it worth anything to them. They could never tear down the tower, never build the station. Their $46,000 scheme, their interested big company, all of it had just become meaningless, dead on the page. Erland had done this years in advance, quietly, alone, telling no one. He had known, had seen clear into his own daughter's heart, and he had built a wall he knew Verna would one day need. He did not leave her money. Money can be sued for, fought over, taken away. He left her the one thing no greed could reach. He left her a place the law would protect forever and a reason to stay. Verna said all of that to Sloane, in the level voice of a woman with nothing left to fear. She said she did not want to sue anyone. She did not want Sloane to lose her license. She only wanted to be left in peace. She only wanted to keep the tower, and to keep the work Erland had done his whole life going. If Sloane left her alone, it ended here. If not, Dale Aldous was ready. And the very thing that would bury Sloane was her own trick, the way she had pressed a grieving widow to sign without telling her what it was. The storage room went dead silent, only the wind keening through the gaps in the tower. Sloane Pruitt stood there, the papers trembling faintly in her hand, and for the first time Verna saw something crack open in that cold face. Not anger, something more like pain. She looked around the tower, at the thank you letters pinned along the wall, at the thick ledger open on the table, and perhaps, for just a moment, she saw the father she had never let herself understand. Brock Lenhart spoke first. He folded his glossy folder shut, the smile gone, and muttered something about a waste of time. He went to the car. Sloane stayed a moment longer. She opened her mouth as if to say something to Verna, then thought better of it. She set the sheaf of papers down on the lid of the cardboard box, very gently, almost carefully. Then she turned to go. But at the door she stopped. She did not turn around, only said, so quietly Verna nearly missed it, "He never told me about the book." Verna looked at her back and answered, just as quietly, that he never told anyone. That's how you know it was real. Sloane stood still another second. Then she walked out, got in the car, and the black SUV rolled away down the muddy dirt road, smaller and smaller until it vanished into the vast gray of the North Dakota plain. Verna stood at the tower door and watched until there was nothing left to watch. Then she turned back inside, where Emmett stood waiting, his wide eyes still rimmed with fear. She smiled at him and told him it was all right now. No one was going to tear down the tower. No one was putting anyone out anymore. Good does not win with a bang. It won here with a sheaf of papers a quiet man had prepared years in advance, because he loved his wife enough to protect her even when he was no longer alive to do it. That winter was a long one, the way all North Dakota winters are. But it was not as cold as Verna had feared. She used what little money she had, and a small loan that Halvor Berg insisted on giving her without interest, to fix up the tower. Not into anything grand, she just patched the roof, replaced the heaviest of the rusted tin, put in a wood stove, made the storage room at the base of the tower into a place a person could live through the winter. Emmett worked alongside her, and he was astonishingly handy. The hands of the whole town had once looked down on turning out to know how to do most anything. The work went slow through the short December days when the sun showed for a few hours and then was gone. Verna learned to mix mortar, to nail tin, to caulk the gaps so the prairie wind couldn't knife through. Her hands, made for the fine motions of the bindry, took on new calluses, rougher ones, but she didn't mind. She found in the heavy work of her hands a kind of healing. Every sheet of tin she replaced, every gap she sealed, was a way of telling the man who was gone that she had found this place, that she was keeping it, that she would not let it fall. Sometimes in the middle of the work she'd stop, lay a palm flat against the old wood of the tower, and close her eyes. She felt she could almost feel the warmth of all the hands that touched this place before her. The hands of the farmers who'd brought their grain, Emmett's hands on the broom, and Erland's holding the scale, keeping the book, keeping a little back. In the evenings, after the work was done, the three of them, Verna and Emmett, and often old Halvor come by to visit, sat around the wood stove. Verna read aloud to them, books she had rescued over the years, and Emmett, the boy who could barely read when Erland first took him in, sometimes read a short passage too, slow and stumbling, and no one rushed him. Firelight danced on the old wood walls. Outside, the North Dakota wind howled and the snow lashed the tin. But inside that tower worth nothing, there was a warmth no glossy resort of Brock Lenhart's could ever buy. There were people. There was a roof. There was a community knitting itself back together around a single fire, and a strange thing began to happen. The tower, once forgotten, slowly became a place of the town again. People came by. At first it was the ones with names in the ledger, come to visit, to tell their stories, to sit by the fire. Then their children and grandchildren. Then people with no connection at all who had only heard of the man who'd held the scale here and wanted to see it. Verna set up a long table in the storage room, laid the ledger open on it for anyone who wanted to read. She pinned the thank you letters up along the wall. The tower became something between a museum and a home, a place people came to be reminded that Kansas is real, that it had lived here once, out in the middle of this field. Verna did one more thing. She thought about the line at the bottom of every page. Keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. And she decided that line should not just sit in an old book. With Dale Aldis's help, she set up a small fund in Erland's name to help the farm families and the people coming to the end of their rope in Cottonwood Reach and the towns nearby. Not a grand fund, just a little, enough to carry a family through a hard season, the way Erland always had. Keep a little back. The person she trusted to keep the fund's books, to mind the accounts, was Emmett. The young man the whole town had once called the slow one, now sat at the long table every day, carefully entering each bit of help into a new ledger in his slow, exact, neat hand. He still stuttered, but now, when he spoke, people waited for him to finish, because Verna had taught the whole town, by the way she treated Emmett, that a person's worth is not in how fast they can talk, but in what they do in the quiet. There was an afternoon in late winter, when the snow had begun to melt and the first slant of spring light came through the round window at the top of the tower, that Verna climbed back up to the cupola. She carried the ledger and a pen. She sat down beneath the window, the place where months before she had sat and wept, and she opened the book to the last page, the empty one after Erland's final entry. Before she had climbed, a letter had come. There was no return address, but Verna knew the hand at once, the sharp, even hand of a lawyer. Sloan. The letter was very short. She did not apologize, not quite, because there are people who never learned how to say they're sorry, who had it taken from them in some far-off winter when their mother walked out. But Sloan wrote that she had read her father's will again, this time really read it, and she had understood that he had not abandoned her the way she'd believed all these years. In the will, the part left to Sloan was not nothing, but a letter from Erland, a letter she had thrown away unread in her fury after the funeral. Now she had picked it up and read it. She didn't say what it held. She only wrote one last line. Keep the tower. It should belong to someone who understands it. Verna folded the letter and put it in the tin box with the other thank yous. Perhaps, she thought, that was a kind of saving too. Late but a saving all the same. She thought of all of it. Of the day she stood at the grave with $1,043 and a scrap of deed. Of the 34 years she'd thought she understood a man she had only half known. Of the tower appraised at nothing, that turned out to be the most precious thing she had ever been given. Of Emmett, of old Halvor, of Astrid Moe, of Travis and his 2 children, of every name in this book, hundreds of lives caught and held by a man who never wanted anyone to know. Then Verna took up the pen, and on the first empty line after Erlend's la entry, she wrote. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the one being helped, a young family that had just lost a crop, that Erlend's fund had just carried through. She wrote the amount. And in the note column she wrote, in her own hand, the same words Erlend had written at the bottom of every page for 34 years. Keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. Then she signed her name, Verna Sorensen. The book did not end with Erlend. It went on, and that she understood was the legacy, not the tower, not the land, not the sheaf of papers that had saved her. It was the next line in the book. It was another hand taking up the pen and writing on. Verna closed the ledger, gently, and sat a long while beneath the round window, looking out over the North Dakota plain as it turned from snow-white to earth-brown, getting ready to be green again. Below her she could hear Emmett talking to someone who'd just stopped by, his voice halting but warm, and the laughter of a child. The lamp was still burning. The work Erlend did was still being done. The tower worth nothing still stood there, rising over the plain, not because it was worth a penny, but because it was the place where something worth more than money had been kept back, year after year after year. They thought they had taken everything from Verna. They thought that pushing a 61-year-old widow out of her house with $1,000 had ruined her. But they had forgotten one thing. They had appraised it wrong. They appraised the tower at nothing, because they only knew how to measure what can be weighed in money. They did not know how to weigh a book full of names. They did not know how to price a promise kept in silence for 34 years. That is the oldest mistake of people like Sloane, like Brock. They go through life with a scale that measures only one thing. They look at a grain elevator and see rotted wood, rusted tin, a figure of 0. They look at a boy who stutters and see someone useless. They look at an old widow and see an obstacle easily brushed aside. They never learn to see the thing underneath, the thing that does not glitter, that does not shout, that shows itself only to those willing to stand still long enough and climb high enough. And because they cannot see it, they never get to have it. Greed, in the end, is a kind of blindness. It can only see the price and never the worth, and that is why they lose. That is why they always lose. Because the most precious things in this world are never in the pile of property people fight over. They are in how we treat one another. They are in a notebook full of names, and they are in this, that we never lock the door against a person who needs saving. Verna Sorensen came down from the top of the tower, one step at a time on the wooden stair she had made sound and safe. She passed the grain bins that had once stood empty, that she now used to keep her books. She came down into the storage room warm with firelight, where a once thrown-away boy sat keeping the accounts, where an 84-year-old man sat warming his hands, where a community had found itself again. She went to the wood stove, fed another length of wood into the fire, and left the driveway door standing open a crack, the way Erlend always left it, so that anyone who needed a place to stop could find the way in. Keep a little back. For the one who comes with nothing. The lamp is still burning.